Regina. I'm one of the co-founders and CEO of Topsort, and Topsort, like we like to call it, monetization infrastructure. But not too much about me right now, and I want to talk about kind of monetization and kind of the time we're in right now. So first question would be, how many of you today work at a marketplace? Great. And then how many of you think the marketplace will be still around and thriving by this time next year? Love it. Okay, so before this trip, I kind of changed the name of this this talk from how to break through monetization in a bear market to how to break through in uncertain times. Because I was like, okay, if like Joe Biden can't call it bear market, I'm not going to call it bear market. And the other thing that we did was like, I started looking at news, and we're just kind of a little bit like you got sucked into this sort of rabbit hole and got really scared of like what's happening right now in the world. And I'm sure I don't have to kind of tell you as the audience today in this room that we are in a pretty challenging time. Just take a look at kind of some of the recent news headlines. It gets really overwhelming. And yesterday, one of my co-founders sent me this news article that was talking about how Meta is quietly laying off probably close to 15% of the teams. So it definitely is challenging, as you can see, right? There are a lot of big name VCs here, marketplaces, whatnot. Yep. So I think, how does that really, translate into, like, how is that relevant to us as entrepreneurs of this time? And I think each generation of entrepreneurs sort of have to deal with the macro in different ways, and there are different challenges that come with it. The direct impact is that money has a cost now. I think last year, everybody was super bullish. You talk to anyone, they're like, we can just raise infinite money, hire more people. And then now just, growth is not something you can just buy straight up through VC funding. And everyone's sort of realizing there is a cost, and VCs are getting pretty strict around, can you be profitable? Do you have a path to profitability? And what's your CAC, right? So I think that's something that is just a very direct impact we all feel. And the other thing is that companies need to be able to fund their own growth now. Kind of more and more investors are very sort of cagey around, I don't want to just be the sort of tool where you kind of raise money and then funnel this right back into Google or Facebook for CAC. So then that's something I think everybody needs to start thinking about. And then I think it's always interesting to kind of look back in time, because we're not, it may be the first time we're experiencing this, but a lot of companies in the past have dealt with similar situations. And those are typically the moments that are lesser like spoken of. So let's look at some of the bigger names in Silicon Valley. Okay, how do those people do it? First one's Yahoo. They're one of the first few companies that really pioneered internet advertising, and they're also kind of famous for just using the auction model for it as well. They're really the OG in online advertising and started doing original ad unit sales. And it looked like that, a very classic Capital One ad that you can probably feel somewhat familiar to what you would see today. And there are two guys that kind of did a study on this. So they started, it was a huge playground, early days, Wild West, and everybody was experimenting with reserve prices, auction-based model, second price auction, first price auctions. And it's a field experiment that's done by two Michaels. Michael Ostrovsky and Michael Schwartz. Michael Schwartz today is the chief economist at Microsoft, and we snagged up the other Michael at Topsort. So he's one of our co-founders, and also he teaches at Stanford Business School on auction theory, game theory. In the past 2 decades, he's been working with marketplaces in the Valley, namely Google, Yahoo, LinkedIn, Pinterest, a lot of those guys in setting up auction-based theory and sort of sponsor listings. And we got talking one day, and I'll kind of talk about the story of how we started the company later on. And then, like I said, one of the companies Michael worked at is Google. Now we all know the name, or Alphabet, but before they were called Google, they actually had a different name. It's called Backrub. So that was the almost Google name. And when they were Backrub, they really were trying all kinds of different things. So we dug up some really old stories and news headlines. As you can see here, this is actually a real ad of Google in 2002. And it reads, it's tiny font, it reads intranet search. Yeah, I can't even read the second line, but basically, okay, cool. Yeah, so they were trying to monetize through selling the search engine to bigger companies and have them use it for internet search. And they were also kind of just experimenting with the really playing like the Yahoo style ads, just slap something on and call it a day. And there are two experiments that were really interesting about Google besides the name. And really, I think it's around that time when they were naming themselves Google, they were also asking the same question: how do we monetize, right? And what's interesting about Google, the other experiment they did is that they actually had a very classic model of selling the top of the search feed, saying it's, pay us $1,000 or whatnot, and now put you on top of this search keyword or this category for a fixed period of time. And it was working for them. It has a lot of drawbacks, obviously, but they actually got to a pretty sizable revenue before they considered anything else. And then they got kind of wind of this model called auction-based, right? And then they were kind of in this situation of how do we transition or test it out without pissing off any of our existing advertisers? Because they're all happily paying this amount, even though we sell out here and there. It feels like we're leaving money on the table. Google is growing. What do we do next? And then what they did is that they found the really unattractive slots in kind of the corners of Google, like the very little throwaway spots. Nobody was really kind of getting territorial over those. And then what they did is that they were like, okay, let's try this with auction-based model and see how this will work out. And they started doing that very quickly. That revenue surpassed the fixed slots. And that's what we know today as Google AdSense. Yeah, so Google is really like, they do many things like home devices, like all kinds of stuff, but really they're advertising business. They have 80+% of the revenue coming from ads. And Amazon. So Amazon, they're really fascinating. Basically, what happened with them is that they have this marketplace model, the very famous case study from 1P to 3P and all that. But really, they've been experimenting with this idea of pay-per-click and auction-based sort of sponsor listings since 2004. So there are two companies that they actually started as completely separate entities and in a very hidden fashion. One is called ClickRiver, the other is A9. And those were both from very early 2000s. They were just kind of playing with different ideas. And in 2007, that's when people start to say, okay, is Amazon.com going to start getting into advertising and try to take over the whole thing? Right, and today, that little label that you see when you go Amazon, when you search something that's water bottle, whatnot, that generates $31 billion for them last year. I think it's even more this year. And it's the most profitable part of the business. The revenue itself is on par or even more than AWS today. And the profit margin is way more. I think it's multiples more because they don't have any data center or any sort of hard operational cost with that. And it really acts as a subsidy to the marketplace, right? They get to sell everything, and on top of that, they're still having this revenue stream that acts as a defensive mode, and also they get to kind of, still basically subsidize and move inventory. It has all these kind of benefits that Amazon has been quietly enjoying. All right, and then the last one of the big giants I want to talk about is Apple. I think Apple is even more of a unique case because they're this very sort of cool brand that's very high up on Ulta, and they're kind of famous for being really cool, really aloof, and you don't kind of associate them with advertising or kind of how do they monetize, right? They put together hardwares and sell it for pretty good brand equity and brand high markup. So they're one of those companies that do really well. But then actually, another thing that we can kind of assume or we know about Apple is that they also have a lot of cash, so they can hire really good talent. They have some really smart people working for it. And that makes one thing super interesting, which is around last year, there was this big case between Apple and Epic Games. And because of the sort of lawsuit, some of the materials came out as the exhibit. And one of the PDFs that came out was actually an internal slides within Apple when they were having the discussions of whether or not we should do in-app promotions in the App Store and doing forecasts for next year, thinking about how much money they're going to have to invest in this and how much they're going to get out of it. And the really smart people at Apple actually ended up underestimating the whole potential of the business by 2x. So they did this really complicated analysis, and what happened in the end is that they surpassed it by 100%. Yep. So do you spot the pattern? So the giants have all kind of, just like all startups, they would tinker with all kinds of ideas, try different things, see what works, what not, back rub, intranet searches. And then what they ended up all converging into is this sort of model of auction-based sponsored listings. And it's the thing that really is quietly making them a lot of money. You don't hear about it. You don't feel like it's too much impacting your user experience. And Amazon actually, for many years, put their advertising revenue in their quarterly earning calls under other. So it's really hard to see, and you have to look closely to find out. And there are a few weird things about it. One is that it's really super non-intrusive. It feels like, it's just part of the feed. Even Google, right? We see ads, we still use it every day. You don't feel like they're doing you dirty or anything. And the other thing is, in contrast to how sort of easy it is to look past those little labels, it's making these giant tech companies numbers that you just cannot ignore. And then it seems really simple, right? It's just, again, like a tiny label, and it feels like it's very small improvement over the user experience. But how did it take Amazon more than 10 years to build this and scale this? Now it's 5% of their GMV, and it's this huge business, but it did take some time. So what we think, what we learned from this is that really the right ads don't hurt user experience. If you do it well, you scale this carefully, and it doesn't hurt the site relevance either. It actually sometimes improves it because you give the small guys a way to break through the ranking algorithm, and people have some levers they can actively participate and pull. And really, the other thing that I think almost everybody in advertising is sort of getting really scared over is the disappearance of cookies, cookie apocalypse, we like to call it. And the thing is really why should an ad care about who I am as a person, whether I'm tall, short, whatever color hair or eyes I have? It doesn't really matter. What's really important is that you are on that website in that moment searching for something relevant. And really all the user wants is that, show me something better. Don't care about yesterday I saw a pair of shoes. Today I'm looking for a backpack, so just show me that. And, show me what I'm looking for, when I'm looking for it, and show me something better. And all of these sites, are companies that have done this experiment and have done it well, and it's all a big part of their business now today with auction-based native monetization, and it's a big part of how we become profitable. So a common quote we hear from a lot of marketplaces is that, but we're not Amazon, or we're not trying to become Amazon, we're special. Or we're just very unique, we really care about the user experience and whatnot. And really, it's not just Amazon. Pretty much the same comment you would hear about everybody, we're not Google, we're not Airbnb. I think it's always kind of a mixed feelings when these things happen. So the belief we have here is that you don't have to be an Amazon to really try this and make it work. In fact, it's really hard to build this, and the reason we started this company is because we actually saw that there's this very concentrated expertise in the Silicon Valley for these tech giants, but we've seen that it could work for really, really tiny companies small marketplaces early on, or delivery apps when it's just one city, or a B2B marketplace with 5 sellers. So that's kind of the one thing that we believe in. And the other one is actually we believe it's kind of integral to the path of these giants becoming giants instead of the other way around. So we started this company because we believe in that, and we've been working with a few dozens of marketplaces now across the world in different different industry, ranging from 15 million GMV to decacorns, to people that have about $1 billion in revenue and whatnot in different countries. So it really is something that's super unique, and kind of thinking about how do we scale and jumpstart this whole journey with them. And okay, I'll try to be short about this part. So basically, there are 3 of us, and I'm the one that was a small e-commerce seller. And actually, I studied computer science and started something in college that was an e-commerce business. And I would say the sort of my the thing that really got me very excited about Topsort is the fact that I was very fed up with Amazon and Facebook ads. It just made you feel kind of stupid. It's like, how does this work? And why doesn't it work, right? You can burn a lot of cash and still feel like it's not quite working. Michael, like I said, he's very experienced in the Valley on first principle engineering and sort of the economics of it. And then Francisco is kind of a serial entrepreneur that used to lead engineering for Groupon, really fantastic engineer and sort of great architect as well. So then from our own data, what I think is relevant to share here is that we started looking at, we have a very unique data set of marketplaces, B2B, B2C, different life cycles and smaller ones that are very corporate, bought by like Walmart or like these big retail groups. And then ones in the middle, like European pharmacies that are super privacy centric, or super apps that work with very small street food vendors who are non-technical and really don't care about marketing or like pay-per-click stuff. And then also the classics, right? Like L'Oreal, Procter & Gamble, and all kinds of sellers on these platforms. And what we saw when we started analyzing our own customers, and just because we do work with them and we have kind of the information we can see, there's some really interesting and surprising patterns there. The winners were not who you think they're going to be. And they're really like, at first we're like, okay, you know, maybe the big customers, the big scale ones, or the ones that have very sophisticated sellers will be the ones that create the most uplift and things like that. But really it came down to kind of one factor. It's time. It's the ones that really kind of put in a lot of time and effort in like trying as many things as possible and sort of like gave up on finding the perfect moment, essentially. It's an experimentation, really. And there's no way to make all the decisions from the very beginning. Pretty much all the organizations, a lot of them don't even have ad expertise from the beginning, and they're just like, we have to monetize or we die. And then that's why I asked the question earlier, right? A lot of them, I think, were just under huge pressure with this like sudden change in the macro, and they're like, we just have to be profitable and we need a path to it. And all of a sudden, the schedule to become profitable also became a few years earlier, and many of them just, you know, realized they have to make those decisions and the calls on the go. So it's not really one size fits all. Just like all the marketplaces are unique, right? How much your seller is willing to pay per acquisition is also very different based on the B2B and B2C world and what's the average order value and whatnot. And I think what we see is that with the right infrastructure and building blocks, you can definitely start learning faster and experimenting more. And the learning curve would compress, but it doesn't just disappear. What took Amazon 10 plus years, you still have to go through it in months and stuff. And it's really an investment that marketplaces need to think about whether it's the right time and when's the right time. And sort of we see between the winners and the ones that are not yet winning is that this very sharp division. The best ones are really the ones that put in the work, build the org, took the leap of faith and just do it, and they end up investing in talent and learn the playbook. It's rare, but like people, I think now more and more people who are ex-Amazon, ex-eBay are starting to kind of, spread the knowledge in the field as well. And then the worst ones are the ones that you feel like you're just selling them an umbrella, where, they're like, okay, it's a sunny day, like everything's going well, we don't need it. Or, like it's raining, but like, can you make it work in 3 days? So, kind of, having this mentality of like doing endless amount of SWOT analysis and just having all your ducks in a row really is something that I think ends up just doesn't work. And what's also interesting we see is that when these companies start investing or start working on monetization, there's this organizational anti-trend. What I mean is that a lot of these companies we work with, it's public information you can look up, where like, they would do layoffs or like organizational changes, right, with the year and everything. So the entire organization could be flat or like trying to adjust itself. But then the individual, the departments that are like building the media, the on-site monetization would grow. And it's like this really interesting dynamic where like the whole organization is sort of like shrinking or flat most often, and then a lot of them are like saying, hey, this is the only P&L that's growing, and like, because the P&L is growing, we're trying to kind of build an org for it as well. So it's really organic, it's a kind of a whole process. So here's my take on what I think the future of monetization is. So I think growth is going to continue having a cost. It's much better for everybody, for the VCs, for entrepreneurs themselves, for just the operators who want to have the experience building it. It's better if you can just fund your own growth. And what we also think is that monetization is not an afterthought. It really is something that everybody should think about building from day one and bake it into your business model. Because if you have a really operational heavy marketplace, you're going to have to think about how to become profitable. And at some point, if the funding stops, right, how do you kind of build that bloodline yourself? And the unit economics just something I think kind of everyone's taking a closer look at. And then for the lighter sort of marketplaces, so for the operational heavy ones, I think they kind of just do it and they have to do it, and it does make sense. It's kind of it's almost like a life raft in that sense. And then for the light ones, I think what people overlook is that it also contributes to the vibrancy of open marketplaces. Let's say you're selling art or services or like NFTs or whatnot. What happens is that we see that sellers are happier and they're more engaged. When you have a marketplace, and it's easier to onboard sellers when they know they have a say in the final sell-through rate and the decisions. So I think that's kind of something that people tend to overlook, that thinking they kind of play against seller acquisition, but it actually helps a lot with seller acquisition. We've seen a lot of marketplaces started working with us by just putting it kind of in a more hidden spot, having the really established relationships with the brands first, and they're like, okay, like we're just going to onboard these guys, and then gradually, once they have the really good data, really good numbers from the beginning, and it's both sides, right? Everybody's also kind of looking for cheaper places to deploy their marketing budget these days. Once they see sort of the benefits of it, they start to double down, and kind of the floodgate opens that way. My key message here is really just to experiment. It may work, it may not work, but you will never know if you don't try it. And I think what we're doing, and many other companies in the space are doing similar things, is that we're lowering the barrier to experiment. It used to be something that's very expensive, and very hard. You have to have 100+ engineers to kind of just try this out, and no pressure to turn it into something quickly. So what we do is that we have dashboards coming out of the gate people can use to sort of set this up, and also API-only solutions to build this. And really, this is another one where it's just kind of a quick modal. And what I think our key message here is that, even if you just put up a message or billboard on your own, think about additional ways you can monetize as a marketplace. It just makes sense. And we see such a huge difference between the ones that are trying it versus the ones that don't. Okay, so I think the key message here is really the willingness and the speed to experiment. And sometimes, just withhold that little message that could be like a bit of arrogance. We're saying, hey, we're doing just fine, and maybe, not now. I think that's kind of the key thing here. And one of the taglines of Topsort is we like to call it game-changing monetization infrastructure. And the early theories of kind of auction theory is very much tied to game theory. And just treat it like a game. It's a fun game, and it's really kind of how the sellers treat it as well. It's a multiplayer game. People are competing, and they're trying to sell more through your marketplace. And you just have to make sure you stay in the game. And that's it. Hope to see y'all next year.
Can I get? Oh, perfect. I wanted to ask a question around monetization, and also for early stage startups sometimes, and we talk at Speed Invest with so many early stage startups, pre-product, pre-revenue as well. And sometimes monetization is not necessarily, you don't have to have it figured out right away, and business model is going to change 10 times by the time you have it all figured out. So how much is that? How important is that for an early stage startup in terms of what's your advice for early stage startup, how to have it figured out, the business model and monetization?
Yeah, I think it's easier than you think to get started, and it's harder to scale it. So I think everybody can pretty easily put up something that's maybe very manual in the beginning. You're just selling like your top suppliers a banner and telling them, hey, I'm going to get you this much exposure that's very high quality because you have a more targeted audience than just like random search engine out there, or like a pop-up ad somewhere. And that's easy. So testing that it works for your marketplace is really easy. Getting the scaling part figured out takes a bit of time. But like my recommendation would be to just like try it, because I think getting that organizational buy-in from, especially for like early stage ones, people view it as a distraction. But if you were to position it in a very natural way, sellers sometimes appreciate it more, because I think everyone's sort of always at this stage, everybody's always looking for additional ways to kind of just get their name out there. And whenever somebody presents for us, when we actually talk to like marketplaces, sort of like the gatekeeper in that sense. They all have a very strong opinion on like what the in-app experience should be. And then what we see is actually the marketplaces are sort of hesitant at first, but the brands that try it, they're super happy, because they're just like, okay, finally, like I'm really done with kind of how we do marketing today. I'm always looking for, a higher ROAS. And on average, when these new channels open up, you can see easy up to like high single digit or double digit ROAS, which you can really not get anywhere else on those mainstream channels today. So I think that's kind of like my take on that.
Thank you.
Is this on? Yeah, okay. Thank you very much, Regina. I couldn't agree more about the starting with monetization on day one. That's also been my experience. I have a question. You mentioned that quite a few companies are a little bit hush-hush about using auction as a model. And do you see a reason for why that is? Or maybe sort of a sideline question. The classic argument with auction-based model is always the second price, what Halbarian and others write about. Is it maybe that they're fearing that the transparency about that is going to be asked or so? Because I'm always a little bit surprised as to how few questions are about what that second price is and where it comes from and all these things.
So the question is more around second price, or why they're so hush-hush?
Yes, yeah. Or do you think that maybe the transparency with the second price is the reason why people are so hush-hush about the auction-based model? Or is that just this is just a thought from my side. I'm not saying it's the case, but I'm just...
Yeah.
Well, what's your thought about why people are so hush-hush about the auction?
Yeah. I think it's definitely surprisingly, like people are just surprisingly quiet about it. And my understanding of the situation is honestly really simple. I think it's too good to be true. It's something that's just like, they don't have to advertise it so much to the public. It makes sense when you're doing your earnings calls or showing it to your investors, those charts. And it's sort of, especially if you're a B2C marketplace, it sort of speaks, it distracts from the main message, right? And what's interesting about that is that sometimes like the revenue and the profits could become almost on par with the main business. But then I think it's very counterintuitive, and what we see is it's almost like you're just talking about money, and I think like it kind of becomes more of a closed door topic because of the nature of the sort of business model. I don't know. I think people are becoming more vocal about it, though. It's becoming more like talked about because of companies like us and a few other companies in the space, and it's becoming more competitive, where there are more pieces out there. I saw this article recently about Walmart Connect, and I think they switched from first price to second price, and they saw 60% revenue increase. So it's interesting, like kind of, yeah, I think, like I honestly just think people don't want to talk about money per usual, and it's too good to be true in some cases. I don't know if that's a good enough answer, but that's kind of what my take, yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
I had a question. So two recent news that might be relevant. It's more of a follow-up. Like yesterday, Ticketmaster announced their dynamic pricing to their primary ticket sales just to compete with the secondary market. That's like the ultimate monetization in a sense. And for example, another monetization example, Twitch got a lot of backlash to keep the 50-50% split. So my question from these two examples is like, how do you, let's say, measure the consumer feedback when you're designing your experiments in terms of how aggressive you define your monetization? So do you guys have advice for that? Because I think you focus on the vendor side, right?
We side with the marketplaces always, and then we know that if the vendors or the consumers are not happy, it's not going to be sustainable for us. So the question is, how do we, like,
Yeah, I can clarify it.
consumers, yeah.
How do you define the experiments, or let's say in your guidance or advisory, to basically measure like how much is too much in terms of monetization?
Yeah, totally. A few thoughts around this. One, I think it needs to be handled really delicately, especially at first. Actually, a step back before that. So I think marketplaces is really expensive business to pull off, having all those pieces come together and scale that. The ones that don't do it through this way, they end up still having to monetize some other way. We saw the example with Etsy, right? They were just kind of like, their stock was like tanking all the way, and then all of a sudden they started doing the sponsor listings thing, and now they're kind of doing almost like a private equity model of buying up marketplaces and try to flip it like that. But when it doesn't work, you have to increase. A lot of them end up increasing the take rate as a marketplace. And there's still backlash with that as well. So I think it's always like a really tricky balance. And then I think the second part of your question was?
Yeah, that's basically about experiment design.
Yeah, experiment. Yeah, I do have a lot of ideas. So we do measure those things, right? A few things. One, whether the sponsor listings click-through rate is on par with organic listing. That's like a very simple one. Like if you're having relevant ads or irrelevant ads, like people won't click on it and you won't convert that well. And there's like, if you're operating on a CPC model, it's going to be abysmal revenue. So that's a first one. What we aim to do is to typically even have higher click-through rates with those sponsor listings than the organic ones, but at least on par. And that kind of shows you that, your overall percentages are okay. And the other thing that's counterintuitive here is that, especially with an auction-based model, it's not necessarily about the number of slots. Like I think what Amazon, when they started getting all the backlash, is when they started switching, like the whole page is like 60% ads now. When they were just like one slot or two, I think people were mostly okay with it. So if you were to kind of not get too greedy or like, kind of treat it more organically and have it grow at a steady pace, if you build up the competition so the CPC goes up instead of having multiple slots, and just kind of like fill it with ads, that's irrelevant. I think those are two guardrails that kind of out of the gate I would think of.